Welcome. I'm Nancy Gutierrez, President and CEO of the New York City Leadership Academy. Welcome to our webinar, Principal Supervision and Distance Learning, What's the Right Approach, with the one and only Dr. Meredith Honig. Hello, Dr. Honig. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning.
I'm going to introduce myself briefly, and then I'd love to talk a little bit about why this is such an important special webinar for me, being a big fan of your work. All right, so just quickly, the Leadership Academy, I have the honor and privilege of leading an amazing 17-year-old organization that first started in New York City, but has now worked with leaders across 36 states. And I'm originally from California. I've been a former teacher, school principal of 2 different middle schools, a district leader. And what I'm most proud of in life is that I spent the majority of my career in my hometown of East San Jose, California. So excited to be here. At the Leadership Academy, we believe that leadership and equity go hand in hand, right? That you cannot be an effective leader in today's society if you do not have a sharp equity lens. That becomes especially important in the midst of 2 pandemics we are engaged in today or dealing with today, COVID-19 and racial injustice. And so as we talk about principal supervision today, we will also talk about what it means in today's context. Now, I am very honored to be today's moderator because I have studied your work, Dr. Honig, for some time. And I'm excited to dig into your book. I read it thoroughly. I think I read it twice. I will reveal my favorite chapter, my favorite quotes throughout today's conversation. And for everyone here joining us today, first of all, thank you for being here. And secondly, please use the Q&A to post your questions throughout today's conversation, and we will have time at the end to go back to the Q&A and engage. But just quickly, a little bit about Dr. Honig, whom I will refer to as Meredith after I formally introduce her. But Meredith studies central offices. Now, it's an exciting topic to me. All right, being, I've worked in a district the majority of my career, and actually I cited you throughout my entire doctoral dissertation. And so I actually didn't know anyone would study or I'd find research on central offices, and I found your work, and I was very pleased with that. Now you're a professor at the University of Washington, and you focus on the promise of central office leadership for equity. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. In 2014, you and Lydia Rainey created the District Leadership Design Lab to help improve understanding of central offices and their vital role in educational equity. Now, the way I like to think about this is that you basically helped us draw the through line, right? Because often as you're engaged and we talk about, all right, teacher has, is the most influential, has the most impact on our youth. And we say, well, principal has the second, layer of impact. The further you go out, within a system, it's harder to draw the through line. So what I love about your research is that you draw that through line for us and give us a research base to think about. Now, for the last decade, you've also been the director of Leadership for Learning program at the University of Washington, which won the Excellence in Educational Leadership Preparation Award with UCEA. And shout out to your work on developing equity-focused leaders. Congratulations on that. You are the author of this new book, Supervising Principles for Instructional Leadership, a teaching and learning approach. Today's conversation really is about this approach. So I think the best place to start is to really, give a brief summary of what this approach is. Now, the next slide here has the 7 points of the teaching and learning approach. And for those of you joining us, just take a brief look. You'll see that we're going to engage with these different seven topics and moves throughout the conversation. All right, so we're not going to go in order, but we're going to integrate it into a conversation about what central office roles mean, specifically the principal supervisor, when we think about advancing educational equity. And I would say, Meredith, the big reveal here, 2 of them. One is that, that this is about capacity building, right? So that we'll talk about the fact that this role is around building other people to be their best selves within the principal role. And the second thing is that, we're also talking about not just building capacity of school principals, but building the capacity of culturally responsive, equity-focused instructional leaders. And so that is the lens we will engage in this conversation today. All right, so let's get this party started. Dr. Honig, Meredith, how did you come to doing this work?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. And it's great to be doing this with you. I've long admired your work as well. And, you know, as you mentioned, kind of your trajectory and all this, my work too has always been all about ensuring schools have the support they need, the resources, the partnerships, the autonomy, and so on for excellent student learning every day, especially for our Black students, our African-American students, our Latinx students, those living in low-income families, the very students who are disproportionately negatively impacted by the move to remote learning, which we're going to talk about today, and also the institutional injustice that brings some important new light today. And I know we'll get to that as well. And the joke's not lost on me. Wow, you focus on central offices. Because actually when I was first starting out, an equity leader who I really admired at the time said, if you care so much about educational equity, why would you focus on central offices? And I think part of what she was getting at was, you know, central offices are so far from schools. If you really care about equity, shouldn't you be closer to kids? And she may also have been thinking about kind of the bad rap that central offices sometimes get in research and also the popular press, you know, that suggests that central offices are just kind of somehow broken in some way. So it's a fair question, but it's also a part of the contradiction that we live with in education, especially those of us working on equity, where we know that barriers to educational equity are systemic, but policymakers and funders have tended not to invest in a key part of the system that's so vital to getting to equity, and that's the central office. We also, and we also know, and you definitely know this, that there's no way that tens of thousands of people wake up in the morning and ask themselves, how can I do a terrible job for schools today? Which is what you might think if you were reading kind of that popular press, those articles about central office. It's actually just the opposite. And we know these people, you know, they get up every morning and they really try to figure out how to do the right thing for equity and for kids. But they're stuck in systems that were designed for something else. So our work on principal supervision is part of a broader effort with research and partnerships to understand how to dismantle and rebuild central offices as what we call engines of educational equity. And about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we started looking at districts that really understood this problem, that if you're really gonna make the central office an engine of equity, the usual strategies are not going to get you there. The reorganization strategies, changing the org chart, slashing central office budgets. You know, leaders in our districts really understood that to get to deeper change, you have to make fundamental shifts in what each and every person in a central office does. And principal supervisors were a key part of that.
Right. You know, I have to confess one of the times I have to tell you about one of the times I got into big trouble as a school principal, and well, it's one of the more memorable ones. The one I feel badly about. It's when my superintendent came to me and he said, "Hey, you know, Nancy, what can we do? Like as a central office, like give me one or two ideas about what we can do to make this, you know, work, you know, to kind of partner on this work." And I said, you know, the best thing you could possibly do for me and for my staff and my community is to leave us alone, you know, to stay out of our building, to let us do our work. We have so much work to do, and I can't also manage you, you know. And anyway, I got into big trouble. And I think as I read, and after I've read your research, I understand why. And I think it's because there was powerful work we were doing all the time, you know, on the ground as a principal, but can we imagine the power that comes into play when you're actually aligned with the larger system, when you're pushing towards the same goals, when you're engaged in this work in a way that, you know, gives you like a huge group of people who are, you know, supporting and building the foundation for you to do the right work by kids. And so anyway, I confess that because I think one of the reasons why I was so drawn to to your research into this book is because that role of a principal supervisor in many ways begins to really define what kind of support central offices can create, right, for school principals, for leaders, for communities. Now, what are the key functions of that role? You know, what, and is this a role that exists everywhere? Give us a little bit of context about this role and the key functions of it.
Yeah, I will. And I just wanted to respond to what you just said about autonomy and being left alone, because you're in really good company as far as that goes. So you can feel guilty if you want to, but know that, you know, we talk to school principals all across the country, and, you know, when we ask them, what can your central office do for you? They say, stay out of the way. But then when we invite them to really expand their imagination about what's possible, they actually do want support from their central office. Yes. Right? But it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah, right. And we can get into the different moves. So what are those types of supports within this tool that make it one of support?
Yeah, I'm with you. And, you know, spoiler alert, you gave earlier, but the main thing that principal supervisors do is they don't supervise, right? And we know this from decades of research on adult learning, and any school principal just knows that we don't grow professionally when someone monitors us, right? But school systems are set up as these like assessment relationships where, you know, your boss assesses you, as opposed to kind of what we know from how adults grow, which is they really need kind of, especially their supervisor, how powerful is that if they dedicate themselves to your growth and that your success is their success. So thing one is principal supervisors don't supervise. And another thing they don't do, which they've traditionally done a lot of, is operation support, like tracking down facilities requests or helping with the hiring of teachers. Our research didn't associate operation support with any positive outcomes related to principals' instructional leadership. And in some cases, it was actually the opposite. The operations work that principal supervisors typically do is actually someone else's job in facilities and HR. And when a principal supervisor steps in and does that work, they're really actually getting in the way. They're taking pressure off the rest of the central office to change. So the key thing that a principal supervisor needs to do if they're serious about supporting teaching and learning in schools is to let go of that other work and focus on supporting principals' growth as instructional leaders. And for larger systems that often have dedicated principal supervisors, that means really clearing off their plates and saying, we're gonna spend as close to 100% of our time on principals' growth as instructional leaders. And in smaller systems, the principal supervisor is the superintendent in a lot of cases. And the thing there is for the superintendent to notice, how much time am I spending with my principals? When I do spend time with my principals, what am I spending that time on? And am I modeling, am I reinforcing the right things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did appreciate page 21, you have a framework in the book that, I loved it. So I've memorized all the pages, but you have a great framework that, you know, outlines these 7 different moves. So I want to talk a little to you about what those moves are. We briefly flashed them at the beginning for all of you joining us, and I will just repeat them to you again. It's fostering learners' agency, joint work moves, modeling, talk moves, brokering, recognizing all learners as learning resources, and differentiation. Now, when I first hear these 7 topics, of course, I think about really effective teaching and learning, right, in general. And so let's talk a little bit more of these key practices. We don't have to go into every single one, but what's something that comes up for you when you think about this framework or the seven different moves?
Yeah, I mean, really thing one is the thing that's first on the list, is helping principals lead their own learning. Because unless that's really your foundation, unless you're really trying to elevate principals' professionalism in that way, then we tend not to see the kind of growth that we'd like to see in terms of the work that principal supervisors are doing with their principals. So, I mean, when you were a principal, do you remember those like start of the year goal setting meetings where maybe your supervisor would be there helping you set goals, and you'd set the goals? And maybe the goals were goals for your growth, but probably not. They're probably goals for your teachers or your school.
Yes. They were goals for impact. They weren't necessarily goals about what I, as the leader, needed to know and be able to do. in order
Exactly.
to reach that impact. Yes.
Yeah, that's one of those like practices that's everywhere in school districts that really is no impact. In fact, you could say it's a negative impact because it takes principals time away from really focusing on their own growth, because typically it involves a principal supervisor checking that the principal has the goals, and then they go away, and at the end of the year they assess how well they did. The principal supervisors in the positive cases, the ones where we could see principals spending more time on instructional leadership and also getting progressively better at it, their principal supervisors worked with them on developing learning plans. So goals are a part of that, but also more importantly, what are you doing throughout the year to help yourself grow? As your supervisor, I won't be with you most of the time, right? Even with a reasonable caseload of principals, I won't be there.
By the way, what is a reasonable caseload? Wallace Foundation says about 12, right? Principals. I know in some places it's like 50 principals.
Yeah. And no, I appreciate that question. I'm glad you stuck it in, because that's often the next question people ask. The thing to think about is what's the work a principal supervisor needs to do, and then how much time do they need to do that work? So if you've got principals developing learning plans that are reflective of what we know about how adults learn, and what we know is that adults don't learn when someone comes in and does professional development to them, even coaching, right? They learn when they have really thought through how they're going to get better as they go about their job. So if you think about that, kind of that's the core of what principal supervisors are doing, is fostering that leadership of principals' own learning. Then you can start to think about, okay, well then how much time does a supervisor need to work with each principal, and how many principals are reasonable? And we've added that up, and we find generally it's between 8 and 12. Anything beyond 12, you're just not spending enough time with your principals. But if you have a lot of principals who are well-versed at leading their own learning, then maybe you need to spend less time with them, and you can manage more.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, I think what you're separating a nuance here in goal setting from what are my goals around the impact I want to see for my students and the impacts for self. And I think that's what you're pushing us on here, is saying like, look, don't forget that who that principal is actually comes into play. And even when we talk about equity around biases, around whatever we bring, that comes into play in our work and our impact as well. So thank you for separating that nuance.
Yeah, and it's so important, because principals, like, you ask them, what do you want to see in terms of your growth this year? And the first thing a good principal is going to go to is, I want to see this in my kids.
Yes, that's why we're there.
And of course they do. And I've been in a university setting and partnership settings, working with leaders all the time, and it's so hard for them to get them to focus on their own growth as a key contributor to what it's going to take to get to kids learning. So we really, consistent with our findings about the principal supervisors, it's really important for principals to have opportunities to figure out what would be meaningful measures of my growth this month, this year. What am I going to do to get there? And chances are it's not a workshop or a PD, formal PD. It's
job embedded PD.
Could be job embedded, could be going and observing another principal and asking for advice. I mean, if you really look at a balance of a principal's day and what they do to kind of figure out what they need to do, they often go to other principals. So like, how can a supervisor support that? But thing one is having like a really intentional learning plan that, like you're saying, really focuses principals on themselves and their own growth. And then they supplement that plan with coaching, both one-on-one and also in leading principal learning communities. And that list of moves that you put up, those are the specific moves that we associated with the positive cases. So principals spending more time on instructional leadership and getting more deeply into it. And we can go into the details of the moves if you want to.
There is one.
Okay.
So number 3 is modeling, right? And I don't know if it's just me, but people just like telling me what to do, typically. They don't necessarily show me what to do. They just like to tell me what to do. And I think I just want to cite here something I read in there. It was on page 47, and it really struck me about modeling. It says, there's a principal supervisor talking, and this person says, I recognize that there's a delicate balance between what I know and what they need to know. And so telling them is not really an effective method. Ultimately, when I leave, I want them to know how to do it, and simply telling them won't achieve that result. Seems like, yeah, duh, like common sense, but I don't know if it's a common practice. And then further along that same page, there's a quote that you say, unless principals understand the underlying rationale for certain practices, they were more likely to perceive their principal supervisors as directive and evaluative rather than supportive, and therefore resist them. So there's both. It's like the how do I do it, and it's the why are we doing this? And I'm just, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the importance of modeling. Obviously these are very busy people. So what does that mean? What does it look like? And I also wonder if some of it is because it's in some ways it's hard to master so many skills and what a principal needs to be able to do. So how do you model it if maybe you were an effective principal, but maybe the thing that person needs to work on you didn't quite master. So how do you navigate that as you're trying? You can't be everything to all people, but yet you need to model what to do.
I'm really glad you picked up on modeling, because it's probably the most important move that any mentor makes, right? And it includes all the things you're talking about, right? Both the demonstration, here's what it looks like when you're working in a new way. Also, here's what I'm doing. Let me narrate to you so you can see what I'm doing, because I'm not always going to do it perfectly, but let me tell you what I'm intending to show you, and let me tell you why. Because unless you know why, then you risk passively doing something and not actively deepening your capacity.
Right.
And yeah, I think the modeling thing also highlights this, how powerful institutions are, because I see so many really strong teachers go into leader roles where good leadership is good teaching.
Right.
And then they start to do something else. They start to do a lot of telling. So, and I think we're all guilty of this. When you have a limited amount of time, right? And you're delivering PD, you do a lot of talking at people. It seems to be what we do. And part of that just may be kind of institutional norms. Part of it is the work that these principals and supervisors are doing around equity. It's so urgent that we really don't have time to waste with taking the time for some of the kind of time modeling takes, but we have to take that kind of time, because that's how you build capacity.
I love that. And I also think there's a level of vulnerability that comes with it, for principal soups who maybe weren't Common Core principals. And now that's, or for a variety of things that, that are required that maybe they didn't experience themselves. It requires a lot of saying, I need to learn how, or to be a consistent learner as you go throughout that role. But it's great.
And you also said something that made me think, I think some people get into leadership roles and maybe, unconsciously at least, feel like they need to have all the answers, when one of the most powerful things leaders do is kind of modeling imperfection and vulnerability, like you said. So I think with that kind of pressure, it kind of lends itself to more of a telling stance rather than a teaching stance. But one of the things the principal supervisors in our studies and our partnerships have been doing is really kind of taking that pressure off themselves and recognizing that the best modeling, it's a demonstration of something that you're both aspiring to, you as the mentor and the person you're working with, and you're both trying to get better at it. Right. And one of you will demonstrate now and the other will demonstrate later, and together you'll move forward.
I love that. Like a thought partnership, but it's a real partnership, a learning partnership. Now, we've gone virtual. I mean, I literally went to the grocery store 2 days ago for the first time in 100 days. And we're all kind of living this new virtual world. So let's talk about this role in the virtual world. What does it look like? What does it mean? What changes?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, everything we've talked about so far can be done virtually. The learning planning, one-on-one coaching. We didn't talk so much about this, but a lot of the kind of teaching and learning that a principal supervisor does is by leading a principal learning community so they can learn from each other. You can do that virtually too.
Right.
What we don't want to see are school systems taking the wrong work and now doing it remotely, right? Or otherwise coming up with new ways to do the same old work. So the frame I want to put on this question is kind of big picture that the current context really begs the question, are we doing the right work? And do we have the systems in place to do the right work? That said, some concrete things that districts can be focused on right now includes that the research is clear that the right work for principal supervisors is to help principals focus on instruction. Mm-hmm. And the shift in distance learning has heightened concerns about the quality of students' learning time, their social emotional health for learning, and other things that, instructional leadership is all about. So now's the time for a laser-like focus on instructional leadership for principals and their supervisors.
Mm-hmm. It's more accessible, right? This learning, these conversations, these convenings of principals, these conversations, the ability to hop into one Google Classroom after the next. I've seen it done, and it's actually more accessible in some ways, but the systems are important, as you're saying.
They are, and it also takes, and this is like its own distinct thing. One is focusing on instructional leadership, but two is actively resisting the kind of pull to focus on operations. Again, right. all those operations are someone else's job. Kind of the all hands on deck stage of remote learning has passed in a lot of districts. We have systems in place for distributing meals that are working, progressively better in a lot of places. We're trying to distribute the hardware and the connectivity. Now's not the time for principal supervisors to jump in and do everyone else's work around operations, but to let, operations do their work, because that is the opportunity for a principal supervisor to help a principal keep their focus.
No, I agree. And I think that there's an anticipated, half year of learning loss that we're anticipating, because of this transition. And so the idea that, like, let's not remediate here, let's accelerate, and let's figure out what we need to do to really support our principals, support our teachers in order to support our youth, right? To really draw that through line again.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk, like one of the common sound bites right now is how the current situation has daylighted kind of the systemic inequities that we're living every day. And now's a time to address those. What we're trying to really identify is, well, what are the systems that haven't been working for kids? And how has what's happening now daylighted some of those? So principals and principal supervisors can really make it a priority to focus on those things. And some of the things that we think they can be asking are things like, with their principals asking, how well do we know our students really? Right? Did we have to scramble to figure out who had a device at home and connectivity, or did we know that already? Do we already know which of our students have food insecurity or trouble getting transportation to access meals that we're now providing, on campuses when school's not in session? Did we already know our students that well? And if not, how can we put the systems in place so we can know them, so that, should something like this happen again, like we can act more quickly.
Fair point.
Yeah, another set of questions that remote learning really amplifies relate to teacher collaboration. There'll be research on this probably, like for now, I'll bet that the schools that were able to pivot the fastest and the most effectively to remote learning were ones that had really rich teacher teams who were already working well together, who could come together in this moment and keep the focus on instruction. So those kinds of questions. And also, of course, communities and families.
Right.
So a lot of this is daylighted. Did we have the right partnerships with communities and families? We're probably seeing that we don't, right? So how can we now get those in place?
Right. So and these are issues that the principal supervisor in many ways is really well positioned to be able to see really clearly and support their principals get better at whatever that is.
Exactly.
No, that's extremely fair. Now, one thing that, so I guess what I'm hearing from you is that when I ask you what changes, you're saying nothing, that you continue to go deeper on the work you need to do, and it actually highlights the things that maybe weren't happening as effective as they should have been.
Yeah.
And another thing in your book that struck me, page 74, you talk about some of the positive cases, and by positive cases, I mean had most impact.
Yeah.
The principal supervisors who had the most impact, that there was a part there around shielding principals from the central office. Now, I thought to myself that may be a little controversial to put in the book, but I think it's very, I appreciated you saying it. There was a quote from a principal supervisor who was really impactful in her role, said, "It takes fighting our bosses sometimes." And then another part, where you write that in positive cases, principal supervisors buffered or actively shielded their principals from interruptions to their instructional leadership focus, including requests from central office colleagues that were separate from pushing the agenda around instructional leadership. Just talk more a little bit about that for a sec, because I think what I'm hearing when I read this is that the skill around managing up becomes really critical in the role of principal supervisor, and you're already kind of sandwiched in between at the central office, so it can be tricky, I can imagine.
Yeah, you're not just reading my book, you're reading my mind right now, because that's where I was going to go next. Because, and again, I want to put it in the present moment, all with the theme that the work's the work, and at the same time, the present moment has daylighted some things about the work. And earlier I suggested some questions that principal supervisors could be especially focused on right now. Also right now, principal supervisors could be especially focused on helping principals feel comfortable taking action. Right now is not the time to wait, right? To hear what we're supposed to do before we make efforts to serve our kids. So when I talk to an assistant principal who has been like the person for African-American boys at his school, and he tells me, I haven't reached out to my guys yet because I'm worried that if I do that, that's going to open us up to criticism, that we're not doing that for everyone. Or, worse, it'll open us up to lawsuits, right, about inequities. I mean, I think that's something we need to be really concerned about. I mean, he needs his hands, freed so he can go connect with students as best we can right now. And, waiting until we can serve all kids just perpetuates the myth that that's what we've ever done, right? That school systems have always, served kids inequitably for a variety of reasons. And so to now kind of hold out until we can do it is just kind of living in a reality that's not true to our present time.
Well, let's go there, and thank you for saying that. I mean, I'll tell you how we define equity, which is that basically that equity is when school systems create an environment that is intentionally built for our historically underserved youth, for all, for kids who it hasn't in the past been historically built for, right? So we're creating that space. I mean, I can read the language to achieve academic, social, emotional, regardless of race, ethnicity, language, and other characteristics of identity. But I think that, we're in the midst of two pandemics right now. I asked the question earlier around like, how does the principal supervisor role change or shift in a virtual environment? I believe the answer I heard was, it doesn't. Go deeper, go harder, go faster, really figure out where you want to focus, knowing that you have much more data to work with now, and you understand the true current state versus desired state. I think that's what I heard. And then, the next question is, does it change in the midst of two pandemics right now, COVID-19, racial injustice? Does the role change? Does it continue or does it not? Do we just continue to go deeper on what we know we need to do?
Yeah, and I would love for you also to highlight the work you all have been doing around that, because you've been pioneers in that effort as well. What our research talks about are really kind of the basic kind of school principal and principal supervisor systems and practices that need to be in place if districts are serious about excellent opportunities and outcomes for students around teaching and learning. Otherwise, it's a system of workarounds, who has the individual, resources and relationships to make things work. And that's fundamentally inequitable. What we're learning now when we talk about this kind of is like the next steps in our book is how the present moment really daylights the importance of taking an explicit anti-racist approach to this work. And so what that can look like, are things like, when we talk about principal supervisors and principals having a deep instructional focus, taking an anti-racist lens to that and asking specifically, are we, principal supervisors and principals, really supporting culturally responsive teaching, right? And are we learning together how to do that progressively better? How are our principals doing with having those hard conversations about racism, among our teachers, in our community? How ready are they to lead those? What has been their experience so far, and how can we help them get better specifically at that? And we're also seeing a lot of deficit language right now about students, and like their lost learning. I had someone ask me, isn't this generation of kids somehow damaged? And I think we need to worry about kind of the hidden racism in that, because aren't they really saying all those students of color, the low-income students who don't have access to technology or other things, aren't they really damaged right now? And we just have to be really careful about that, because that narrative doesn't get us anywhere good. And if you take a strengths-based approach, to what that question is getting at, you'll see, a lot of kids have strengths in their families and their communities. Those are rich places for learning for some kids, and schools are not. And shifting the center of learning to home for a lot of kids has been really to their benefit. So one of the things, a supervisor can do with their principals is making sure that their focus on instruction is really from that anti-racist stance. And they can take an anti-racist stance to all of this. So we talk about, for example, principal supervisors resisting working on operations and instead focusing on instruction. Well, there are a lot of ways to resist, right? So we encourage principal supervisors to just say no, but they can also, taking an anti-racist lens, start to track, well, where are the log jams? Which schools aren't getting access to certain services? Are those the schools with, majority students of color and low-income students? In a lot of districts, probably, yeah. Well, that is urgent to address from an anti-racist equity stance.
And right now, especially too, at the end of the year, are there students being recommended to be held back? Like, are we thinking more about remediation versus acceleration in this work? Now, the way we define, and I said this earlier, a culturally responsive instructional leader, right? Yeah. We talk about teaching, but it matters for leaders as well. And the way we define it at the Leadership Academy is to say that this person recognizes the impact of institutionalized racism on their own lives and the lives of students and families they work with, and they embrace their role in mitigating, disrupting, and dismantling systemic oppression. Exactly, I think, how you described it from that role, so to take that lens. And I think the other piece I wanted to point out here, page 113 of your book, you talk about building equity-focused principles. There are 3 questions that I want to point out, and I'd love your reaction to these 3 questions, or just a little bit of context for them. So the 3 questions are: number 1, how can we ensure that the definition of principalship and our principal supervisors are supporting and emphasizing true educational equity? Right, and it's exactly what you're talking about, that this work is not an add-on. It's not only come from the equity office or the chief equity officer, that it's a part of the actual role. So how do we ensure that the definition is part of the role of both the principal and the principal supervisor? Number 2, how will our charge to help principals grow, as equity-focused instructional leaders, so this is back to capacity building. So we can say capacity building in a variety of different ways around working, on instructional leadership, but how are we actually building capacity on being equity focused? And then there's a third one that really struck me around the principal supervisor in their coaching stance or capacity building stance, which is, how do we help the principal supervisor themselves deepen their understanding of how their own positionality and biases are liabilities and assets in their work with principals? Right, that we're not out of the woods. Like you move to a certain role, we still carry these biases. This is lifetime work. All of us can engage and work around our own biases, our own, and yet know that there is still work to do. So how do we highlight those in our interactions, not just our moves as a leader, but our leadership interactions as we engage with our principals?
Yeah, and I want to invite you to kind of share your smarts about this. I'll just say that what our kind of this research and our research moving forward highlights is just really that the importance of not just taking an equity stance, but really taking a race explicit stance.
Isolating race, yeah.
right? Because unless you name it, then we're still kind of talking in generalities. So, and we have to be careful because, you know, there's been a lot of research on how you can name, you know, African-American boys tend not to be reading at grade level, kind of at this point in their school careers. That daylights kind of race-based inequities, but it also risks associating a group of people, African-American boys, with something negative, right? So we have to be careful to take a strengths-based, race-explicit approach to this. And it, you know, the work is the work, right? The work has to focus on instruction. And I think what we're talking about is, and we need to take a race-explicit approach to that from its foundation, right? Not as an add-on.
No, I appreciate that. And I think you're pointing out, like, we also believe that you have to isolate race in these conversations, and at the same time, and so, like, there's this constant conversation around equity should be infused into everything we do in the central office, into every role. And I think that's what we just talked about. Like, it should be infused in your role as a principal. It's not like an add-on, you know, it's not a workshop. It should be infused into your role as a principal supervisor. And yet it also has to be explicitly named.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't take away from, you can't, you know, you might have a district and say, look, like, we don't need a chief equity officer because guess what? It's infused into everything we do. Great, kudos to you. But guess what? We still have to name it really explicitly in everything we do. So it's almost like we have to hold both at the same time as we engage in this work, you know, because there's a risk there of it not being put front and center as part of this work, and also as it being seen as separate, and which is what we don't want, because that is, these go hand in hand. Leadership and equity, instruction and equity, culturally responsive leaders, like all of that, that's one.
Yeah, it definitely is a both and. And I think the thing that we've gotten really good at is adding kind of attention to race on to to roles that are otherwise unchanged. And the challenge now is, how do we infuse it into the role as an inseparable part, so that our standards moving forward shouldn't just say, you know, an excellent principal is a great steward of kind of standards-based instruction. You know, they need to be an excellent steward of standards-based instruction that explicitly ensures that historically marginalized students have excellent opportunities and outcomes. Like, that just needs to be what it is to do that work on instruction.
Well, and that's why I appreciate, you know, your research base, because someone like me, I'm a practitioner. So, you know, I do some action research. I've tried things on, I would, you know, attempted to do stuff. And I know what works in real time. And as we engage in this work, and from history and an expertise of being there, you know, front and center. But I do appreciate that you bring that research perspective, because another thing you said that is related to equity, and then, by the way, we'll open it up to Q&A. So get these questions, start with, you know, getting those questions in the Q&A box, is that you recommend against grouping principals by students' performance levels. And I thought that was interesting, because in so many districts we say, all right, so, you know, in New York City, they had the chancellor's district, you know, that was the lowest 5%, or, you know, and we do that as a state, CSI schools, TSI schools, and then we put one person in charge of all those schools. And there was a research-based recommendation against that move. Can you just talk about why? And then we will shift over to Q&A. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, I mean, my brilliant intellectual answer is, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I like your brilliant intellectual. I mean, yeah.
There just isn't a track record of that working or leading to any kind of sustainable change. If you think about things from a learning standpoint, and we go back to the original learning theory, and you think about, how do you make a vibrant professional learning community? You make sure that there's kind of varied expertise in the group. So the key question for district leaders when they're figuring out how to organize their principals should be, are these the right principals to be together to help each other grow as instructional leaders? And that will mean a mix of people in terms of their backgrounds, and a focus on principal strengths, because every single one of a district's principals has some strengths around instructional leaders. And if you just position the same people as models, that does not create a very healthy learning environment.
Right. And
if you group principals by test scores, that's not organizing by kind of principals' capacity for instructional leadership. It's organizing by test scores. So students' performance on standardized tests, which is typically organizing by neighborhood income, right? But if you're building a learning community that's focused on principals, then you want to think about who they are as leaders and what kind of collaborative setting will help them learn well together.
I mean, you're also making an argument against tracking in general, but when we can, that's a different webinar I think you and I can dig into, but grouping.
Yeah. And then, you know, the anti-race lens on that has got to be integral to it, which is, don't we know that it's difficult to retain leaders of color if they're alone in a group, right? So shouldn't we attend to that when we're figuring out the composition of our principal teams?
I appreciate you bringing these topics up. I was a turnaround leader in my day, and and that's, yeah, and grouped accordingly.
Yeah.
So let's turn to Q&A. I could, Meredith, Dr. Honig, I could talk to you forever because I really enjoy this conversation. There's tons of questions coming up, and I'm going to start with just one that's bigger picture. Like, we haven't talked about evaluation, right? Principal supervisors are, yes, capacity builders, but they also have the duty to evaluate. So where does that come into this conversation?
Yeah, when we first did our research, one of the districts, it was actually part of New York City Public Schools, one of the sub-districts there, they experimented with not having supervisors evaluate at all. Because they were really trying to redefine the role and say, I'm not your evaluator, I'm your partner. So initially we moved forward with that idea, but no other districts did. So we accept that principal supervisors are going to be the people who do the evaluation of principals. And what our research shows is, again, the importance of keeping that teaching and learning frame on that relationship as best you can, right? So not making the relationship about evaluation, but making it about principal empowerment to lead their own learning and principal's actual growth. So the principal supervisors in the positive cases, in various ways, took the district evaluation system tools and adapted them to be more kind of learning tools for principals, like by making it more, you know, adapting it to be kind of the learning plan development process that we talked about earlier. Some principal supervisors said, look, here's your evaluation grade right now. It's the fall. Here's what it is. You're going to improve. Let's intentionally plan for that. And we'll work together to collect evidence of your practice, and we'll be partners in your evaluation.
It sounds like growth mindset to me versus fixed mindset. I mean, it sounds like, you know, I'm challenging you, I'm engaging you, I know you can do it. Let's do it together. Let me support you. Let me model for you. Let me build capacity, right?
Yeah, and it's also, you know, formative assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's like some of these questions, it's like they just seem like common sense, but I guess they're not common practices, and I see that as well in the work I do. Yeah. And there's another question here, so thank you for that response. Another question here around how should principal supervisors determine whether to have interaction with members of a principal's leadership team? You know, when might this be helpful and not undermine the principal's role?
Yeah, and I would say, first of all, just asking that question is step one. So kudos to the person who raised that. Because sometimes the best principal supervisors, they loved being a principal. They love principals. And it can be
recreate themselves.
Yeah, it just can be really hard not to kind of go in and do for principals, just even with the best of intentions.
Yeah.
So, you know, what our research suggests is thing one is to resist doing anything on that a principal can do for themselves. And then, you know, keep trying to lead through the principal, right? So the principal ultimately needs to lead that school level team. And just to be really intentional. So what would be the purpose of my sitting in on that team? It can be really powerful. For example, when a principal supervisor is modeling for teachers in a school, hey, I'm this principal supervisor and I'm here to give them feedback, right? I'm not here to evaluate, and they're opening up their practice to me, and they're asking you to open up your practice to them.
Yeah, I've been in situations where the principal supervisor would almost like uses it as a way to say, like, I'm a learner too.
Yeah.
This is my coach. This coach is going to focus specifically on me and my moves, my interactions. I want to be better for you.
Yeah.
So it's, I appreciate your answer there, asking the question, and
Yeah, but one of the things that gets a little tricky is, you know, we see some districts where the principal supervisor starts to help the principal with their progress monitoring of their school improvement planning work. You know, and again, the more a principal supervisor puts that kind of evaluation frame, the monitoring frame on their work, the harder it is for them to actually have a real learning partnership with their principal.
Right.
You know, so again, just, you know, first position, try to resist that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a question here, and I think it's a fair question. It's around, and I think we have time for maybe one more question. So if folks want to get their questions in, but it's about the conversation we were having around how not to get distracted by the operational pieces and stay focused on instructional leadership, even amidst the, you know, the two pandemics, and to, you know, and this person is saying that important piece of remote learning is to get these Chromebooks out, understands that it is operation, and says what you are saying is that effective support for principals during this time might have been better to put systems in place for the operations of our district to take on that distribution, so instructional leaders can stay focused on teaching and learning. And I think emphasizing your point, but you know, if you could just underscore, gives a little bit more around that.
Yeah, exactly.
There is the balance, because our students needed Chromebooks to be able to engage with learning.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of districts, I mean, this was a crisis. This was an unprecedented event. Suddenly kids are out of buildings, and now what? And I'm not going to criticize anybody for being all hands on deck ever. At this point, months in, just like this person said, the district needs to have systems in place for getting the hardware and the connectivity together. That's not what a principal supervisor can uniquely especially do.
Interesting.
Right. And so, you know, in the districts that we studied, part of why they got to this new way of thinking about principal supervision is they said to themselves, you know, the work of helping principals grow as instructional leaders is so important. We need their main person, their supervisor, to really make it their own work too.
And fair point.
Yeah.
I love that. Who's uniquely positioned to actually do that? And since your expertise is around really supporting our students in their learning process, like, do that. That's your gift. That's your, you know, great. And page 113 for the person asking around those 3 instructional leadership, those equity focused leadership questions, page 113. A question here, what's one thing principal supervisor should not do? And I think you've been answering this throughout.
Yeah, I just that wasn't an eye roll. That was a, God, there's so many things, right?
Well, what's something we see them doing often that maybe they should not do?
Really, the operation support. I mean, it's so tempting to track down that requisition for something related to the facilities, or to work with HR to get that person hired. It's so tempting. And you can say, as a principal supervisor, what I'm trying to do is save principals time so they can really focus on instruction. But there's so many examples of that invariably over time, those operational matters just eat a person's day.
Right.
So to really resist, which is also putting pressure on the rest of the system to change. Because every time you step in and do someone else's job, that takes pressure off them to take a really hard look at what they're doing, and if what they're doing is the right work.
And it goes back to the conversation we had about buffering, right? In many ways, you're buffering the principal to do the work they're uniquely positioned to do, and you're almost protecting your own time to keep doing the work you're uniquely positioned to do. Final question, a culturally responsive leader, like what are some key leadership moves that a principal supervisor can make to help a principal be more culturally responsive in their instructional leadership work?
Yeah, I mean, I think thing one, and I want to turn it to you, Nancy, because you're the expert at this. I mean, I could answer it too, but you're here, so why? But I would just say, like, thing one has to be like a definition of the principalship that has that, you know, culturally responsive leadership at its core, because that's ultimately what the principal supervisor's job is, which is to help principals grow along those standards. I would add, I think a couple of things. Don't separate equity from instruction like that. You know, I think that's a big mistake that is made. It's like, so because it says, you know, instructional leadership, you know, maybe you assume that equity is not, so it's integrated, right? So as a principal sup, make sure that people really know who you are, know what your stance is around the work, know what your expectation is.
And I would say number two, oh, I had a plane flying over. Sorry if you can hear that. And the second thing I would say is that in many ways you have to make your stance as a system very clear so that principals are free to do their best work around equity, right? It should not, you shared the story earlier, Dr. Honig, about, about leaders trying to do things behind closed doors or when you are positioned to actually manage up and push against the system above you and create the space for our principals to say, no, folks, listen, equity matters. Let me show you the data. Let's talk about this. Make it part of the cultural practice within the district to actually have these conversations, to help give them the language to build capacity around how to do this well, and to in many ways create that space and those conditions for them to do their best work.
Yeah,
I would say as well. Awesome. Dr. Honig, it's been so great. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I know we still have so many questions coming in. I wish that we could answer all of these questions. See so many amazing people here joining us today. I think we've talked about so much today. We talked about the intersection of equity and leadership. We've talked about what it means to, as Cheryl Watson Harris and New York City Department of Ed always says, keep the main thing, or, which is around teaching and learning. We've talked about acceleration versus remediation. We've talked about, focusing on what the work is versus all the noise, which is necessary, such as operational work, but to, continue to do what you're uniquely positioned to do. What are one or two key takeaways that we should take from today's conversation, to take with us? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main one, which I think kind of how you frame this conversation really reinforces, is that this isn't about remote learning, right? Mm-hmm. This isn't about like, how do we use better technology in teaching and learning? There's an opportunity for that. But the real thing is kind of the way that this crisis that we're in and the new social movement that we're in has really daylighted ways that school systems are not yet set up to serve African-American students, Latinx students, and others who've been historically not served well. And how can we take this moment to really get into the weeds of the central office? That's where the systems live. It's a really basic place, and really look at how does our hiring, how does the way we do professional development, the way we assign students to schools, how do our basic systems, how are we seeing now that they reinforce educational inequities, and let's move forward.
Yeah.
And the second thing I'd say is to just keep looking for good models, right? So one of the things we're trying to do in our work is say, not just, human resources is broken, it's inequitable, but here's what it could look like moving forward. And so, thing two is just, encouraging district leaders to kind of train all their smarts on this and to bring a new imagination to what their school system can be.
Yeah, and we can share some resources with everyone who's here today. We have an Equity at Work tool that kind of highlights the research, like here's what it could look like in the ideal state. I think you're reminding me of a couple of things here. One is that we've often said that slow and steady, steady wins the race. And I think right now we're saying, hey, look, like this is not piece by piece. When we do it piece by piece and little by little, it's not really working to serve our students who need it the most. This is an overhaul of the system, and there's no better place to look than your research base that that really highlights for us and engages with what a really effective central office that is equity focused can achieve, can do in its desired state. And so I hope everyone here will join me in grabbing a copy of Meredith's book and looking into that research, because like I said at the beginning, I didn't imagine there was anyone who would spend their life studying central offices. Friends, here is the person, Dr. Meredith Honig, who studies central offices and who has, given us a lot of research-based answers to a lot of questions that we all have about how to be more effective. And I want to remind us of something you said at the very beginning, which was that, look, all of us come to this work with the best of intentions, right? We come, we want to do right by kids. We want to do right by our teachers, by our principals, and principal supervisors are uniquely positioned in between schools and central to be able to do this and to, have a good understanding of what's happening and also be able to push the system. And so we know that, but we also know that all of us need our capacity built, and we need to be better. We need to ramp it up. We need to do better. And we're dead. I know we're all committed to it. So we're so grateful for your research. Please keep researching and giving us information we need to be the best leaders we can be. Any
Awesome.
final words?
Just thank you for your great questions. And I think you're getting at this, but just the other thing is just to really kind of, for district leaders to just see the great people you have in your system, really see them and help them be their best selves.
Mm-hmm.
Just
and
a
listen.
Started with.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much. It's great to have you. Just as we close here, we want to just mention that tomorrow, we talked a lot about big picture today. Tomorrow, we'll actually have a live demonstration happening here at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We hope you will join us. Two amazing leaders, Dr. Michelle Shannon and Boston-based principal Christy Connolly, will do a live demonstration of the teaching and learning approach we talked about today. So we hope you will join us. Thank you.